Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we'll see what happened in the studio when George Martin helped the Beatles produce the Sgt Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. So George Martin was considered the fifth Beatle. He was their producer in the early days, and they respected his opinions. In 1994, George Martin, along with William Pearson, wrote a book entitled With a Little Help from My Friends, The Making of the Sgt. Pepper. And we got to go with George inside the studio through his thoughts on what went on, and let's see how this great album got made. So George mentioned in his book that one time he and Paul were in the AIR studio, and they started to think back about events that happened, and George Martin said George Harrison had done something, and Paul said, no, it was Ringo. And they were both so sure they were right, they both began to laugh. And George Martin then said, if we can't get it right, then who can? So I know that's true. In our family, my sister would mention a memory, and I wouldn't recall it. And at the same time, I said a memory to her, and she didn't remember, or we remembered it differently. So since George was working with the most famous band in the world, I'm sure he didn't forget that much. So let us go back in time with him now. So George thought that Sgt. Pepper was like nothing made before. The Beatles, according to George, didn't think they were creating art. They just wanted to do something different. George said it right. The album was a 40-minute vision one could trip to and have fun in. Pepperland was a place where friends helped you get by, traffic wardens came to tea, holes could be fixed, and Mr. Kite guaranteed a splendid time for all. Things in this Never Never Land were getting better all the time. So in 1966, Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, was confronted by the Beatles, and they said they didn't want to perform live anymore. So Brian had 5 years of them touring, and he thought that they would do 5 more years and maybe another 5 years. So back then, it was commercial suicide to stop touring. George said that many of the groups back then only did live performances and didn't do recording at all. So Brian felt like it was the end when the Beatles decided to go into a studio for months on end and record. Well, 1966 was a bad year for the Beatles. When the Beatles were in Hamburg, they got a telegram saying, "Do not go to Tokyo, your life is in danger." They were playing the Nippon Budokan Hall, which many Japanese consider sacred, and the Japanese police took the threat seriously, and the concert was held in a state of siege. When they went to Manila, it got worse. The Beatles were asked to visit with Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos on the way to the afternoon concert. Brian knew the Beatles were tired after touring Europe and then immediately going to the Philippines. They wanted a day off, and the Beatles asked Brian to relay the message, and the response was that they must come regardless. And once they got to the Philippines, it was tense. Paul told George Martin that Brian was begging them to reconsider. The Beatles felt that they had given them plenty of notice, and they didn't like to be told what to do, so they didn't bend. A military escort came to pick them up, and Brian let the Beatles sleep. And when they turned on the TV, they found out the whole country was mad at them. And when they were leaving the country, the Beatles and Brian got behind a group of nuns to help them keep safe. And when they got to India, they found out that their luggage was in Sweden. They left the Philippines with no money and no luggage. And then next, John got into trouble when he did an interview with Maureen Cleave, who was a prominent London journalist. John said that Christianity would go, it would vanish and shrink. And he then said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. And those statements created chaos, of course. And then he was told he had to apologize. But they had an uneasy feeling performing after that. John F. Kennedy had been assassinated a few years before, so it wasn't impossible to think that the Beatles could be targets too. Other reasons to quit touring was that they couldn't hear themselves performing with all the screaming, and they were tired of living in hotels. So George Martin hears the first song. George and John were in the Abbey studio on a cold, windy night in November 1966. He stood in front of George and sang the song. John nervously asked what George thought about it, and George told him it was a great song. Then George asked John how he wanted to do it, and John said, "I thought you were supposed to tell that." So George wished he could have recorded the song as John sang it to him, because it had a dreamy sound to it, and the song was based on the name of a Salvation Army hostel in Liverpool, not far from John's childhood home. John made the place sound great, but it was hardly the place of romance. George Martin said that John's other world in his mind was the world he preferred to live in. The real world never lived up to his expectations. It was John's idea to use the Mellotron because it had become his favorite toy at that time. And when they began to tape the song, John wanted to play acoustic guitar, and Paul played the mellotron. Ringo was on drums, and George on the electric guitar. So even though George thought the song was perfect when they first recorded it, over the weekend, John and Paul came in afterwards with plenty of ideas to improve it. They made 7 tracks, and it seemed like the song was done. But John, a week later, wasn't entirely happy with it. He said he could hear what he wanted in his head, but he couldn't make it real. Surprisingly, George said John wanted to do the song with strings and brass. George thought that John would want to do a more simple sound. And then George Harrison came in with a North Indian table harp. George provided a great sound effect to the song, and John figured out how to get the mellotron to play a whole random sequence of notes, and Paul came up with a ringing lead guitar. George said that at first he thought it might have been better to have kept the song simple, but Strawberry Fields needed to be complex. George said the song was way ahead of its time. It was psychedelic. George Martin thought it was genius. And many years later, when George met with John Lennon in the Dakota Department, they were sharing memories, and then John said to George, "If I had the chance, I'd record everything we did again." And George asked, "Even Strawberry Fields?" And John said, "Especially Strawberry Fields Forever. Most of what the Beatles did was rubbish." George said he was shocked, because Martin said for John, the vision was always better than the reality. Later, John would say, "The only true songs I wrote were Help and Strawberry Fields." Next song, When I'm 64. According to George Martin, this song had been in Paul's mind a long time. Back in the Cavern Club days, the Beatles used to fill the gaps while the repairs were being done by doing this song along with another. And then they had the acoustic guitar backing. George thought the inspiration for the song was Paul's dad, Jim. Paul's dad played a dance hall band in the post-war years, and Jim was 64 years old in July 1966. Jim loved the music hall stuff, and Paul's song was a nostalgic tribute to his dad. Paul thought the clarinets would take away some of the corniness of the song, and they did a number of tracks, and then Paul wanted to sound like a teenager, so they raised the vocal note by speeding the tape up. Paul always knew in his mind how he wanted the song to sound. In those days, the Beatles were unable to imagine themselves growing old. Paul, as he told George, couldn't really believe it would happen to him. In the 60s, George said it was a particular sin to be old and alive. And George brought up that in 1962, and Paul said, "When I reach the age of 40, I won't be playing songs like Love Me Do." And John, on the other hand, said poignantly a few years later, "When I'm 64, I hope Yoko and I are a nice old couple living off the coast of Ireland, or something like that, looking at our scrapbooks of madness." So George said that this song wasn't psychedelic, mystic, transcendental. It was an affectionate satire regarding old age from a young man's point of view. So I will do another video to continue with George Martin's other thoughts of the song from Sgt. Pepper's. But before I end the video, I want to give out a few fun facts about the album that George included in the end of his book. So Pepper was the longest series of recording sessions, and next, Sgt. Pepper won the 1967 Grammy Award presented to Jeff Emmerich for Best Engineered Record. So Pepper was supposed to be a double album, but the Beatles realized that there would be insufficient new material to be ready in time, so the spare sleeve was filled with cardboard cutout memorabilia. And George Harrison and Paul wore their MBEs on the Pepper uniforms. And last, more dogs have listened to Sgt. Pepper than to any other album in the history of pop music. I love it when people are close to the Beatles and they write a book. We get a glimpse into the lives of the Beatles at a certain moment in time. In the next episode, I'll get more information about the Sgt. Pepper album and how George Martin viewed it. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.